Well, I'm joined now from Edinburgh by Bill Jamieson of the Scotsman, from London by Will Hutton, who's Principal of Hertford College at Oxford University, and here in the studio by the sociologist Professor Greg Philo from Glasgow University. Bill Jamieson, the economists say, and indeed Mervyn King repeated against tonight, his belief that inflation will fall over the next few months. Do you believe that?
Yet again, a very optimistic forecast about inflation from the Governor of the Bank of England, whose forecasting record is none too good. However, to be fair to him, most independent economists do agree that we will see inflation coming down next year. However, that doesn't remove the inflation threat, and I think the big inflation threat lies about 2 or 3 years out from now, when we start to pick up the tab for quantitative easing. That's the real worry.
Do you think that, Will Hutton? I mean, there is an argument that I think Mervyn King might actually agree with, that deflation rather than inflation, despite the appearances, remains the greater problem.
I think there's only one way out of this crisis now, and that is going to be inflation. It is the unspoken truth amongst policymakers, but they don't dare say it in public. I think the inflation will fall a bit in 2012. Everyone thinks that, and they're probably right. I mean, the economy is growing so slowly, and but the risks are it's kind of between a rock and a hard place. I mean, the rock is that actually you've got such low growth, you've got such an overhang of debt, the economy gets crushed. That's debt deflation, and the hard place is actually to get out of it. You have to have inflation to inflate away the real value of those debts. And I have no doubt, actually, that what's going to happen is that in 2014, 2015, 2016, inflation is going to go back up above 5%. And it needs to do that, actually. It's the only way we can adjust, unless we have people really not paying their mortgages, not paying their debts, and having a ongoing financial crisis. This is a real hole we're in.
Yeah, Bill Jamieson, of course that may help people who have debt. Part of the problems of this, and I want to go on to discuss some of the social consequences of this, one obvious one there is if the government is, and I noticed you were nodding vigorously at what Will was saying there, if the government is going to use inflation as basically as a way of getting rid of government debt, it penalises all the things that people have been told throughout their working lives were good, like thrift. The people who saved money as opposed to spending it get penalised, while the people who ran up debts are helped out.
Well, that's correct. I mean, it is a silent financial killer. There's no doubt about that. Even an inflation rate of 3.5%, an inflation rate of 3.5%, the value of your pension fund and your long-term savings will be halved across an average working life. We have inflation now of 5.2%. So, yes, you're absolutely right. It does fundamentally tackle cause a real problem for people who have put a lot of money by. But, you know, you've got to bear in mind the context of this. And economics is always about the lesser of two horrible evils. And my sense is here that inflation will be the least painful. If we go down the sort of Herbert Hoover route of true austerity and, cutting back on government spending, then you will drive up unemployment. And unemployment, I think now, is an unacceptable route forward for us.
Right. Will Hutton, I'm just interested in your impression. I mean, look, this is only the latest in a slew of bad economic news. And there is a sense, isn't there, that people are feeling something close to despair at the moment. I mean, the only sliver of hope they had was the government's story that despite all this public spending cuts and all the rest of it, the economy would start to grow again. Here tonight we've got even Mervyn King saying the recovery's off course. And people are feeling all these things coming at them from 100 different directions.
Well, I mean, I essentially agree with that, although I would just caution. I mean, you say people. I mean, actually, there are people in jobs and who are doing well are kind of onlookers in this. But there's a lot of other people who are not, who are really kind of feeling the pinch. But I think if there's a mood of kind of gloom and kind of stoic fatalism about the corner we're in, there's close to panic actually in policy making circles. I mean, I mean, the government has actually got no shots in its toolbox. We've got to mix my metaphors. I mean, they've pinned all their hopes on this cutting the budget deficit very, very rapidly. It's proving self-defeating. Unemployment is going to. I thought this a year ago. I hate this blaming of the eurozone, the euro crisis for all this stuff. It was clear a year ago that this was a silly policy, and now people are reaching out for the eurozone to excuse it. Actually, the eurozone will bring a second layer of difficulty in, next year. Economies are like supertankers; they're slow to respond to events, and I'm very, very concerned. I mean, I think that we are in for 3, 4, 5 years of really, really tough times. We'd have seen nothing like this since the 19th century, and you're right to say that actually the social consequences of this are very difficult to predict, but it's hard to believe there won't be any.
Greg Philo, what's your take on this? I mean, I'm trying to think of an equivalent to the supertanker analogy, but there's a slow effect on the average person of things that they start off thinking is all this stuff about economics, which they're not very interested in, and suddenly it starts to be affecting their daily lives.
Yeah. I mean, my take on it, frankly, is that it's nuts that we are in a period of history where the productive capacity of the world is probably greater than at any time in human life. And at the same time, we've been told we can't use these productive resources, we can't put people in work, we can't actually use the machines, the factories, we can't build roads, we can't do all the things we're capable of because of a set of financial arrangements which are not the fault of the mass of the population, but the mass of the population somehow have to suffer for these.
Okay.
And this is in a situation where the rich, where the people who have actually profited from all these mistakes, have amassed absolutely gigantic amounts of money, and are now, I'm talking about the richest 10% in this country, have £4 trillion of private wealth, and all across the world you have the same structures of power and control of wealth, and that wealth is now being squirreled away in assets like gold or in property. Go down to London, you can see property prices in London are still going up. In Earl's Court, I looked at the weekend, a 2-bedroom flat in Earl's Court is now £3.2 million. This is absolutely ludicrous. And what we have said is that those assets, that money needs to be taxed. Not as income tax, it's much too slow. There needs to be 20% of the wealth of the richest 10% taken as a tax, as a one-off tax, and use that money to pay off the national debt.
All right.
And that's a radical policy which will work and which would actually liberate the funds that were needed.
Okay. Will Hutton, I'm just again interested in your take on where we are now. I mean, no doubt going to tell me I'm talking rubbish and got the figures wrong, but my memory is that middle-class incomes in the United States from about the mid-70s right through to Bill Clinton's presidency turned it round, actually stagnated. Yeah. And there was this psychological shift where people, American middle-class families, kind of came to believe that their children would not be as well off as they had been. Are we in danger of that kind of effect starting here? That this, during that period, incomes in the UK actually grew, but that just might not happen anymore. And it changes the nature of society in a way.
Look, you're absolutely on the button. I mean, it looks as though real incomes, that's the real take-home pay, people will not have increased since 2006 this year, and that is likely to extend to 2013, 2014. Now, that's the longest period, actually. That's even longer than the 1920s. You have to go back into the 19th century to find a time when there's such a savage squeeze on living standards. And I think that it will mean that a lot of expectations people have of rising house prices, for example, who's going to drive those rising house prices? That 3.2 million flat in Earl's Court is going to be the exception, not the rule. And yes, I mean, you've got these undergraduates leaving university with an astonishing amount of debt. The expectation is there's going to be real income growth for them to pay those debts off. I suspect many of these students, this vast loan book that has been gathered in England at least, is going to become on the government's books because people will never pay it off. The ramifications of this, people will marry later, people will live at home for longer before they buy a house. That people will the kind of unemployment and idleness we saw in the 30s will, I think, return to the UK. Some of the social security kind of reforms make life at the bottom of British society incredibly tricky, incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
I think you will see. I think you will start to see stories of literally people going without semi-starvation. I mean, this is
not just people going to live at home with their parents. I mean, you talk about the bottom 50% of the population who've only got 9% of the wealth. The bottom 20% have no wealth. The bottom 10% have negative wealth. So you're talking about real hunger, real fuel poverty.
Hold on, Greg. You're mixing apples and pears. Wealth is a is a wholly different thing from your income. And we mustn't get over the top in this discussion.
Okay, all right. Let's bring in Bill. Bill, I'm not Jamieson. I'm not expecting you to be out on the in a tent in George Square. Do you get a sense of this feeling of almost despair? I mean, as Will Hutton was saying, we have a government which is pretty much reduced now, when asked about its economic policy, to justifying it by saying that it keeps the interest rate on British government gilts low, which for most people in society means absolutely nothing.
Absolutely. You do have the sense that policy is being made by people flying blind. I would say, however, that there is one advantage here of this regime of ultra-low interest rates. Now, it's very interesting that we've seen a big crisis in the housing market, house prices coming off, huge strains in household wealth, household budgets under pressure, but we have not seen, as we saw in the 1990s, any huge increase in mortgage defaults or in arrears on anything like the scale that we had in the 1990s. And the reason for that is because, for the moment, interest rates are very, very low. And I would say this before we all start taking the cyanide pill. We're in danger here of actually compounding this very, very depressed state we're in. And yes, confidence is very low, but let's not forget that there is a business cycle. And the business cycle turns. And it has turned. We've had four decades in our lifetimes that have started terribly, and the cycle has
now
turned.
You've stopped us all taking the cyanide pill. We are actually out of time, so we'll have to leave it on that positive note.